Thank you so much for joining us today. Happy New Year, everybody. My name is Christina Charis-Donelson, and I happen to be married to Jeff, and I'm a repetitive offender. I never put a name tag on it. So you can call me Chris. It's really an honor to be here in Sunday school, right? I sound funny to myself, but you're telling me I sound okay? Yeah. So it's really a pleasure to be here for New Year's. One of the themes of last year for me, right? Laurel talked about what was your theme for last year, or for the New Year. One of my themes last year was women in leadership. It's my great pleasure to be a physician at the University of Iowa, and all of the top leadership at the university hospitals is now women. So to be doing Sunday school on the day when I got to be with a female preacher was also, that was my theme from 2024. My mind is stream of consciousness. Some people's mind is organized, and mine is stream of consciousness. So you're welcome to interrupt me anytime. I'm going to give you just a few thoughts at the beginning to try to frame what's going to happen today. So if I give you the overview first, right, I'm going to give a few comments, and then we're going to do a series that I call Think, Pair, Share. So these are skills that I use in the medical school with the students. We want students to absorb information and incorporate it in ways that they can use it rapidly in patient care. So what we do is give some period of time for solo work, and that's called think. And then we do a period of time that's called pair, where we talk in 2s and 3s. And then at the end, we come together as a big group, and sometimes there are larger conclusions that everybody wants to know about. Right, so I'm gonna give a little intro. We're going to go into this phase of think, pair, share. And so you can just anticipate that there'll be opportunities both to work individually and to share with others. Like I said, I work in stream of consciousness, so all of this is overlapping in my mind. And the parts that I heard in the sermon this morning, number one, God is a person of stories. One of the ways that God communicates with us is by telling us stories. Pastor Kyle used to say it was like throwing a ball, right? A parabol. God will just throw us pieces of a story. He wants us to catch it. He wants us to process what he's telling us and then throw it back to him, right? So God himself is in a storytelling role where the story might change depending on depending on the particulars of where you hear it. So another thing that I've heard in church several times at this time of year is we talk about our light. Another way that God speaks to us is through light and dark. And so in the Christmas Eve service, we passed the candles, and also today in the children's sermon, right, we talked about light. Light in the darkness, and the fact that our lights are not the same. Some of us, maybe suggesting pastors and entertainers, right? Some people really have beacon lights. They talk to lots of people. Their message goes to many, many people. But some of us are night lights, right? Equally essential, but different ways of communicating. So when you think about storytelling, right, I am going to ask you to tell your own story and to tell testimony, to tell a story that brings us in relationship with God. Well, stories are so diverse. Your story might be stream of consciousness like mine. Your story might be a nightlight. Some of us have beacon lights, and we want to share that. Okay, so there's two more things I want to tell you. Was anybody with me a few years ago when we did storytelling with Jan Rippentrop-Schnell? So in that, the last time I did storytelling, I was honored to work with another female leader, Jan Schnell. I wrote a story about tomatoes. about ripening tomatoes. And I've been thinking about that story ever since. You know, stories change. And so then last year, you know, this would have been 18 months ago now, I went to Truth's Giving at the Englert Theater. And I started thinking about how does my story about growing tomatoes in Johnson County connect with the stories of the people that came before me, right? That I get to grow tomatoes on land that my family owns in Johnson County because there were people here before me that no longer are growing tomatoes or growing corn and squash, right? So I've been thinking about this tomato story for a long time, and it's evolving in my head. I also love to listen to The Moth. Who listens to The Moth podcast on NPR, right? I love the stories they put together for The Moth. And The Moth was live in person at the Englert this year. I went to The Moth on the night of the most brilliant northern lights. Right? You remember that night last fall when the northern lights were so bright they came down into Iowa? And so I was watching the predictors of the northern lights as I was getting ready to go to The Moth. And I was very conflicted. I could see that the lights were becoming more and more likely right at the moment that I was supposed to walk in the door at the Englert. I thought, okay, come on. Surely I could go to the Englert, and after the show, I'll drive out to the country. It'll be darker then anyway. I'll see those lights. Those lights peaked at 8:30 when I was sitting in The Moth. And that didn't make sense to me, how I could miss something so important because I was chasing a story. One of the things I did not like about going to hearing stories in the Englert was they were perfectly crafted. There was a separation. You either were sitting in the audience or you were up on stage. And the people that were up on stage had access to resources, coaching. Their stories were crafted and perfected by professionals. I was like, I love The Moth. I love to listen to it on the radio in my car. But this in-person performance is missing something. It's not the way God talks to us. He talks to us in parable. He throws at a ball, and he wants that ball back. So here today, when I'm organizing stories, I want it to have that more playful feel. These stories are not professional. They're not perfected. They're just our attempt as humans and flawed to get to what God is trying to tell us in this moment at this time. Now, I talked a lot in stream of consciousness. And so if you want to stop me and ask me any questions, you certainly can.
Tell us a story.
I think I told you 2 or 3 there, right? I am. Thanks for noticing, Paul, right? These are ways that I tell stories. So we're going to move into this think, pair, share. And the first section is the think section. And I'm going to give you at least 5 minutes. And thanks for the whiteboard. I'm really giving you 3 choices. I don't want that to be overwhelming. On your paper, oops, that's not what I want. On your paper, I'm encouraging you use your judgment, you're adults, you know how your mind works. I'm encouraging you to either think about spokes on a wheel or to make a line in the middle of your paper so you can write above and below. And if you're really not visual, I'm a visual person, I have to do it visually. If you're not visual, on the paper there's also a list of questions. I think it's on the back page. I'll make a run for pencils if they're short. If you really hate visuals, then on the back page it says, think about a time when you. So there's these three choices. When we're going to talk about, I want you to think about, in at least 5 minutes, I'm going to prompt you to think about moments in your life where God has met you. And if you're a linear person, you might say, well, when I was 15, I went to Guatemala, and then when I was 25, I got married, and then when I was, 30-something or other, my mother died, right? So if you're linear, you might put those events here. Okay, I'm not linear. This doesn't make sense to me. Right? So now I'm over here and I'm going to write down, well, God met me in Guatemala and when I got married and when my mother died. Right? So I don't want it to be in a line. I want it to be free floating. But you choose. How does your mind work? Are there any questions about that? I'm going to go silent now for at least 5 minutes. So if you have a question. Right, it's 10:57, so around 11:05, I'll bring us back together. So I want now to separate into groups of two. Do I need to count? Are we even? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Yeah. These two tables are even numbers, so I want you to break into 2s and 3s because I'm going to we have to break at least in half. Even numbers is 2. Sometimes that's too intimidating, right? We have to be at least in half because now what's going to happen is you're going to start throwing those balls. And I want one person to take 2 minutes and tell a story. Pick one off your timeline and throw it to your partner. And then your partner is going to repeat it back to you, right? I heard what you were seeing, feeling, tasting, touching. I heard what was important to you in that story. So 2 minutes for a story, 1 minute for reflection, and then you switch roles. That's the goal here. If you don't really want to do that, then we should just be in bigger groups, right? So depending on how you want to enter. Okay. I'm just going to pair you off in 2s. But then if you decide to go in bigger groups, we're all adults, and that's totally fine. So if I can put the 2 of you together, I will. And then that'll be Joan and Margaret. And if I can, put you together. Right? So for 2 minutes of torture, I'll put these 2 gentlemen together.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, we don't want that. We don't want that together. Thank you so much for engaging in this story. That's just so beautiful to see how easy it is. Every one of us has really interesting stories to tell. I want to talk just a little bit about the meta, right? I want to step back out of your story for a second. And if you'll popcorn for me, think about, or I can give you another minute if you need it, think about what makes the story so interesting. What did you hear in your partner's story that really drew you in? Right? And, well, I know what the answer is, so you'll just tell me already, right? It's the things that I prompted you about. The things that draw us into a story are the emotion, the stakes, the way the tactile things that were in the story, right? So I want you to spit out for me some of the things that you heard, some of the details that you heard from the stories that drew you in.
Context. And I thought of another one that I tell stories. I always like to use names. I think people are drawn in if you identify them. Hold it over here.
Oh, Naaman that was baptized, right? When we hear the name the person in the parable will remember better.
Well, Laurel told a personal story.
Closer.
Laurel
There you go.
told Paul and me her personal story 27 years ago. It was a very pivotal time in her and her husband's life when they traveled to Vietnam to adopt a Vietnamese daughter. And she described the chaotic scene of her experiences there. Before she met her adopted daughter, she just felt overwhelmed. And that kind of touched me in a way because as a young child growing up, I felt overwhelmed. And she said that besides her burgeoning love for her young adopted daughter, who was at the time about 4 to 6 months old, that in reflecting upon her experience later on, she told herself, if I was able to handle myself then, feeling so overwhelmed, I can handle anything else in my life coming in. Again, that touched me because when I was in the Army, I served in Vietnam during my last year, I had a lot of deprivation. There was no such thing as a door or windows or running water, etc. Anyway, but I felt I was a stronger person for having experienced the fear and the deprivation in the Army, the way she described becoming a much stronger person and being able to become much stronger through her travel to Vietnam to adopt her daughter. Anyway, sharing of mutual experiences, well, sharing of mutual lessons through despair experiences.
That's very beautiful, Phil. Thank you for articulating that one person's story informs our own story, right? So here for Laurel and Phil, it was just Vietnam, right? Their experience of Vietnam helped them understand each other's story. Right? That's a perfect example of stories in community, that parable effect. Anybody else? What makes a story interesting, impactful?
I think it's going to happen. Okay. Wait, Brad.
Give a story to tell. I just had one word, truth. I like stories because it's the truth that really happened to you. Now, I've already had people ask me who Kathy is, and I have no idea, but for your story this morning. Okay.
It's a true story.
Yeah. But I like them because they're the truth.
Well, of course, I differ with that. Okay. Well, I mean, it's the old adage, does it need to be factual to tell the truth? And obviously, there was no Kathy, and hedgehogs and beacons don't talk. So, I don't know, that's an interesting, because I noticed that was a requirement, was that the truth be told, even though I think some stories that are not truthful tell the truth. Parables.
I think we could really go in a lot of ways there, right? That, well, yes, we're using the moth as our tool. And in the moth, the stories have to be your own story. They have to be yours. So that's the exercise that we're doing here. We're telling our own stories. I had a second point, but I lost it. Oh, and so I also, from my perspective, you all correct me, when we tell our testimony, when we're teaching people or sharing with people about the God moments. I think that's more powerful when we're telling our own story, right? You know, Paul did a fabulous lesson here for us. But if you want to call it a testimony, I think there's something vulnerable about that. You really do have to share, like one of the quotes on the form is, stories that are worth telling feel scary. That we're uncomfortable telling them. And that's because they matter.
So you feel like there's a really good story has to have some vulnerability?
A story that connects us to the divine is going to have vulnerability to it. And that's our goal with testimony. Can I get closer to the divine?
But what you're making me think about is also safety. Can we explore your vulnerable, but who hears the story, what happens, what are the consequences? Is it a safe place, or do I have a safety net in case it's not a safe place to be able to tell that?
Well, and I think the stories we choose to tell, it goes back to the personal, but kind of what our values are and what types of things or experiences we experience the divine, whether it's nature or music, community, our own, with the personal values, because most of my stories honestly didn't have a lot of smell or taste, because it's just not.
That's not your style.
That's not my style, but this one did, but mostly.
Yeah, for sure. Our story is going to reflect who we are as people. And you know, whether you're a linear person, whether you're a spokes on the wheel person, for sure, tap into your own style. Yeah, in the back.
I'm Glenn Grass, Margaret Hector's son. Twyla and I spoke, and my story was about being a basic leader in high school. And Twyla asked me something. So you became a basic leader, so you must have really loved it. And I said, well, it was kind of mixed. And Twyla then shared a story that was relevant to her experience. And it blew the boundaries on the timeline and became something where we learned something about each other's stories, you know, relating to basic, and also some of the deeper things that you can learn as a basic leader or a youth leader, and that is how to engage with lots of very different kinds of kids with very different personalities, some loud and outgoing, some more shy, and everything in between and diagonal. And so it kind of got on your theme, I thought, of busting the timeline thing and becoming much more interactive and a mutual learning experience.
For me, what I hear is that sense of that stories evolve. Even though I tell a story about ripening tomatoes 1 year, then 3 years later I might tell that story and it might have a new meaning for me. It's worth telling the stories over and over.
So my question would be, you can tell what is a true story. Is it also important to be honest about telling that true story? There is a difference in it.
I certainly have an answer. Does anybody else want to jump in?
I would just say there can be a fine line between honesty and openness. So, like, I do think it's important to be honest and to not distort the truth, but these stories do involve vulnerability, and people are at different places where they can share that vulnerability. So just because it's not the whole story doesn't mean it's not a true story.
I think it depends on the context, right? Of course, we pick and choose the details depending on what we want the meaning of the story to be. That one of my teenagers likes to recite the plot of her miniseries in great detail, right? She's telling me every piece of information that came from this miniseries, and I am like, it's been 5 minutes, and where are we going with this story? right? So yes, good storytellers definitely contort it, right? Because they're trying to get their point across. And another great example is movies. We went to the Bob Dylan movie this weekend or over the holidays. And there's the scene about the Newkirk revival, right? Bob Dylan is playing at a folk festival and he gets in trouble. And there's 2 or 3 events that are portrayed in the movie as if they happened at the same time in the same festival. When actually, in the history of Bob Dylan, those things happened at various times. And so the storyteller in the movie puts them all together because it portrays a certain, right? So, of course, depending on who you're telling the story to and the point of your story, well, you move the details around in order to make your point. Paul says that we have 10 minutes left, but I want there to be time so that I'm back. I'm like at the moment I'm directing the conversation, and it was way more fun when you guys were talking to each other about specific stories. So I am going to pray and conclude us with the idea that if you still have things that you're talking about, then there's time. We'll be back next week. We're going to do a very similar thing, right? We're going to revisit a little bit of what we did today. We're going to tell some more stories. And then my intention next week, we'll see if it happens, is to give people the mic in longer periods, right? If you have a story that you're brave enough to tell at the microphone, Story Slam in the Moth is stories that are about 3 minutes long. And if you can tell me a story in 3 minutes that incorporates, stakes or emotions or, there's just going to be an opportunity that if you want to tell a more formal story, we'll give you the mic. So let's pray together. Hallelujah, Lord. It is a joy to come together in your community, to have a chance for a new beginning, to recognize that you came to earth embodying who you were, to show us that we have an opportunity to touch the divine, to share the divine, Lord, to know you in a personal way. We're so grateful that you told stories, that those stories evolve, that we hear them through the history of the church, that we see them in our own lives, and that we see them in the lives of our neighbors and friends. Be with us this week, Lord. Show yourself to us in those God moments. Help us to see where we wouldn't otherwise see. We want to be the light. We want to be in the light. Thank you for sending the light. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name.